Okay, so I think and I hope this should be going live. Wasn't that a 1980s BBC children's television programme? I think. Hi, welcome to the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape here at Newcastle University. This is our first public broadcast via YouTube and our first public lecture with our guest today, Professor Roger Burrows. So if you can just bear with us for a moment, because we're testing the technology as well. This new world that we've been brought into is a new world to us, probably as much as it is to you as well. So I'm just going to check in with our brilliant colleagues, Sarah Delap and Alison Patson here, who can tell us if the stream is working. Is it coming through?
It is. It is working.
Brilliant. Well, I just wanted to thank Ali and Sarah for their fantastic work. So we're the team behind the public programmes at Newcastle. I'm a lecturer in architecture here, and Ali is graphic design. Sarah's a graphic designer, and Ali is our coordinator. And together we're sort of bringing this online public programme to you. And today it's partly live from the school. I'm in my office. And we're being joined by Roger Burrows, streaming in from a distant dimension, but here with us. So yeah, it's really exciting to launch this program this year, and we're launching it, you know, obviously against a background of some really quite profound changes in how we're interacting and working digitally and working together in our physical spaces. And part of our thinking for the program is to be exploring what that means in terms of our changing physical infrastructure and our changing environment. So hopefully you've seen the thematic that we're working with this year, which is planning and populism. And really it sits against the background of the soon-to-be reforms to the planning process, the planning system in the UK, that will potentially have some quite profound effects on our built environment. And it also comes at quite a good timing to discuss this, because I believe the government closed comments on the 29th of October, according to the RIBA's webpage on the planning reforms. But I suppose what we're interested in talking about within this planning and populism is, what does popular politics mean in relationship to our built environment? How might we begin thinking around the relationships between technology and the shifts and changes in our built and physical fabric, physical worlds? And I think today's talk is particularly interesting, coming from Roger Burrows, to start the series with, and particularly at this time, as we're looking at the planning reforms starting to be taken further in terms of legislation and being looked at within Parliament. So I was looking at the white paper today and looking at the three pillars of the new sort of overhaul, the quite radical overhaul of the planning process. And those pillars, the planning for development, the planning for beautiful and sustainable places, and the planning for infrastructure and connected places. And within that, what struck me as a turn of phrase that was particularly interesting around what we're going to speak about today were questions around permitted development, so the right to build, the sort of enshrined and right to build on land that you potentially own. And within the revised, the proposals within the white paper was this idea that permitted development would be widened to enable popular and replicable forms of architecture and buildings, and to densify towns and cities in accordance with design principles and mass manufacture and modularization. And I think that's really interesting in relationship to what we're going to speak about with Roger Burrows, who is Professor of Cities here at the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape at Newcastle University. And Roger has recently, well, I don't know if it's that recent, Roger, but his interest in technology and urban culture has brought us together to be kind of thinking and talking about how technological changes, how rises in kind of social media, rises in the kind of telecommunications will be changing our experience of the built environment. So as I say, Roger's Professor of Cities here at Newcastle, with a background in sociology, statistics, and political economy, and also worked in fields of social policy and cultural studies. And Roger's written a lot, and quite recently, on the super wealthy, and particularly looking at, gained some media attention and worked with The Guardian, I believe, Roger, you're looking at the sort of basements of the mega rich in North London. So really today's talk is going to be exploring a forthcoming paper from Roger. Also, it's Harrison Smith as well, isn't it, Roger? That's right, who you've been working with on this paper. And so Roger and I are going to have a conversation for around about sort of 45 minutes or so, exploring some of the questions of popular politics, digital technology, and shifts and changes to our built world, our built environment. So Roger, the paper's called Killer Clowns, Techno-Fogies and Architectures of Exit. I mean, that's quite an interesting title for a paper. It's certainly one that, when you sent it to me, left me a little bit baffled with some of the terms that you're using in there. I'm less baffled now I've read it, which is obviously helpful for the role I've got today. But I wonder if we could kind of go through that title, and you can help us to understand what you mean by these terms and how they relate to our built environment. So if we start off with that first term, the killer clowns, who are these killer clowns that you're talking about?
Well, the killer clowns is a phrase utilised by the activist and journalist George Monbiot in a Guardian article that he published, I think the day after, or at least the week after, Boris Johnson was elected to be our Prime Minister through becoming leader of the Conservative Party. And perhaps if I could just share a screen here, just to show you what Monbiot says. It might be, can you all see that? Bring on the killer clowns, he says. And it really is to do with something I've been very interested in terms of the shifting global patterns of income and wealth. This is what George Monbiot has to say. He says, the ultra-rich are benefiting from disaster capitalism as institutions, rules and democratic oversight implode. Everywhere the killer clowns, as he calls them, are taking over. Boris Johnson, Farage, Trump, Modi, Bolsonaro, Scott Morrison in Australia, Salvini, Erdoğan, Orbán, and a host of other ludicrous strongmen dominate nations that once would have laughed them off stage. These people have all come to power in the last few years. And for Monbiot, quite crudely, but in a sense, it's the essence of the current conjuncture. He says they seek the deconstruction of the administrative state. Chaos is the profit multiplier for the disaster capitalism on which the new billionaires thrive. Every rupture is used to seize more assets. As institutions, rules and democratic oversight implode, the oligarchs extend their wealth and power at our expense. At the same time, the killer clowns offer the oligarchs something else too, distraction and deflection. While they fleece us, we're urged to look elsewhere. We're mesmerized by buffoons who encourage us to channel the anger that should be reserved for the billionaires towards imaginary enemies and customary scapegoats. The point I really want to make using that sensitizing concept of the killer clowns is that since a period, well, the last 30 years really, but certainly in the 21st century, we've seen profound shifts in the distribution of global income and wealth. I won't bore you with the details of this graph, other than to point out that it's been the top 1% and especially the top 0.01% who have seen the greatest capture of income on a global scale in the last few years. And as we're all too familiar, we can do some calculations, and Oxfam do this for us each year, to show how many oligarchs, how many plutocrats, how many very, very rich people would it take to possess the same amount of wealth as the bottom 50% of the global population? Let me just say that again. How many oligarchs would it take to possess the same amount of wealth as the poorest 50% of people on the planet? And in 2010, Oxfam calculated it was 388 individuals. 2011, 177. 2012, 159. By 2015, it was just 62 people, a busload of individuals possessing the same amount of wealth as the bottom 50% of the global population. Then it decreased even further, to the extent that the current estimate is that just 26 people possess as much wealth as the bottom 3.8 billion people on the planet. This provides for me the context for the discussions that we require. We've seen a global shift away from corporate forms of capitalism that require a strong administrative state towards concentrations of wealth in the hands of oligarchs and plutocrats. Hence the rise of the killer clowns, the political wing of this group who have captured so much global wealth, who distract us away from what's been happening in terms of this concentration of wealth and make us concentrate on their ludicrous, comedic misogyny and racism, rather than focusing on the real task at hand, which is to think about the implications of this huge concentration of income and wealth across the planet.
So, Roger, some of the things that you speak about in the paper really take us to the heart of where we're discussing this at the moment. And I wonder if that's a place to kind of get into a little bit of the detail of things. You begin by discussing how some of the protagonists in the story, and I'll let you introduce them, discuss something called the cathedral. And I believe they would probably say at the moment that I'm sat in the middle of the cathedral, right? That I'm here in the institution, this institution that sort of produced this knowledge and ideas that have to an extent kind of led to the sort of liberal democratic culture and society that we currently exist within. And that liberal democratic society, supposedly so, is one that I suppose has been quite influential in forming the physical spaces that we exist in, the spaces of our towns and our cities and our countryside. But the protagonists in your story, and we'll come to who they are specifically in a moment, would term this space the cathedral. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about that, because that sounds like quite an interesting kind of turn of phrase and quite an interesting distinction to be making between this sort of space and somewhere else. That it sounds like, through reading your paper, the protagonists are kind of imagining will exist beyond the walls, the confines of the university and the confines of the sort of the state, also in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, in a rather strange way, the notion of the cathedral is almost a kind of inverted, a crazily inverted idea of almost like an ideological state apparatus that many Marxists would have spoken about in the 1960s and the 1970s. But now there's the belief that there is a group of people certainly working in universities, in much of the media, in the civil service, who perpetuate and promulgate a particular progressive form of discourse. They believe in democracy, they believe in progressive politics, they believe in equality. And the argument of the people who we're going to talk about in a moment, a particular fraction, a particularly influential fraction of the alt-right called neo-reactionaries, have coined this phrase, the cathedral, to refer to a group of people, and as you say, we're sitting within it at the moment, whose job it is, whose role it is to keep making people take a blue pill, in the sense of the Matrix, to educate people in a sense of belief in science, in the Enlightenment, in aesthetics. This is really, I suppose, in popular discourse, it relates to the debates about post-truth and about debates concerned with what have come to be called the culture wars. And we're on the cusp of that situation at the moment, where perhaps expertise, academic expertise, cultural expertise, political expertise, administrative expertise is being challenged fundamentally as being a fetter, as being something which tries to prevent the dynamics of an uncompensated form of capitalism. the killer clowns, in the sense that Monbiot describes them, are have been tasked, if you like, to destroy the administrative state, to invoke the culture wars, and to challenge some of the norms and values that have been dominant in the post-war years. Will Davis, in a recent book called "This Is Not Normal," makes that point, that normal service is not going to be back anytime soon. That the cathedral is under attack, and indeed, in much popular discourse now, you can see this critique of expertise, this critique of the universities, the critique of the civil service. These are non-market-based, potentially non-commodifiable aspects of life, and many people feel that the kinds of things that we engage in are designed to function as fetters to the form of hyper-accelerated capitalism that some of the people sitting behind the killer clowns would like to perpetuate.
And so your suggestion in the papers that sat behind these killer clowns is a range, a group of sort of loosely interconnected individuals that in a sense follow a set of ideas that emerge from the sort of philosophical and theoretical musings of somebody called Nick Land. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about how those ideas that have sort of emerged from his engagement with technology and with sort of cyberspace and cyber imaginaries are informing some of these kind of theoretical positions, and then also some of these practical and sort of real world implications of the activities of the killer clowns.
Yeah, well, it's not just Nick Land. Nick Land is a strange character who, in a sense, has curated and popularized some of the ideas associated with a group of bloggers and technologists. Perhaps if I just give you a little bit of background, probably the key person behind the emergence of what's come to be known as neo-reaction is a blogger who's also a computer programmer called, when he blogged, he called himself Menzies Mulbug. His real name is Curtis Yarvin. And Yarvin set up a blog, Unqualified Reservations, at the beginning of the 20th century, which became very, very popular with a number of people from the alt-right. And Nick Land, who was a Deleuzian philosopher, very, very influential, worked at the University of Warwick until the late 1990s, left academia and established himself in China, in Shanghai, and for reasons that are really not clear, began to translate Mulbug's musings, which are essentially a highly reactionary, libertarian form of discourse, through a filter of French philosophy, through a kind of a Deleuzian filter, if you like. Now, at the same time, two other people who aren't philosophers, they are authors, but who are both entrepreneurs from Silicon Valley, with very, very strong libertarian and post-neoliberal tendencies, also become involved in this amalgam of ideas. The first and probably the most influential, and many people might have heard of this person, is Peter Thiel, billionaire libertarian, who in a sense summarizes the neo-reactionary position in one of his early pronouncements, where he says that he believes that freedom and democracy are no longer compatible. Now, Thiel, as well as writing, is also a multi-billionaire. He made his money through PayPal. He's still on the board of Facebook, and he sets up various startups. And one of the startups that he funded was to fund the activities of another character, someone called Patrick Friedman. And some of you might be familiar with the name Friedman, because this is the grandson of Milton and Rose Friedman, arch neoliberals from the 1960s and 1970s, and the son of David Friedman. Now, Patrick Friedman is also an engineer, worked at Google, and he had the idea, funded by Peter Thiel, to establish something called the Seasteading Institute. The idea that we could begin to build cities on the sea as a kind of a thought experiment for the fundamental idea behind Mollbug and Land's neo-reactionary philosophy, which is the idea, put very, very crudely, that democracy is doomed. Democracy is feta on uncompensated forms of capitalism, and that what we need to do is to set up architectures of exit, both technologically and physically, which allows systems of governance not to be regulated by voice, not to be regulated by democratic forms of governance, but by the ability of people, of consumers, to exit from particular forms of governance. If you want to think about it in this way, this is a very, very extreme form of marketization. We've commodified systems of collective consumption, we've privatized the utilities, we've privatized or attempting to privatize the health service and transportation systems, which once weren't in a strongly commodified form. Now they want to marketize governance. The state itself needs to be marketized, they suggest. And the way that they suggest that this should be done is to not have democratic forms of state, but to have a neo-chimerial form of governance where businesses, companies form GovCorps, where rather than having an elected leader, you appoint a king, a queen, or a CEO to run states as businesses, to run cities as businesses, to not listen to voice, but to have very, very strong forms of exit so that you can have competition between different forms of governance.
So when you talk about exit in this sense, Roger, you mean very, very literally the sort of primary ability to leave a system as being the way of affecting sort of change on that, not a way of affecting our change to sort of our democratic systems by voting, by engaging in kind of civil society, by the extant, currently existing mechanisms of that we have, our sort of legal and jurisdictional processes. You're suggesting that exit is basically get out, so leave somewhere.
Yeah, and let me just be clear, I'm not advocating for this.
No.
I find it a form of fascism that needs to be resisted, but it's a very, very, very strong and incredibly influential ideology, which is embedded within lots of technological developments. And yes, they literally mean, how can we develop forms of literal exit, both from the virtual world and from the physical world? One of the reasons why seasteading is used as such a strong kind of metaphorical device is the idea that you could establish states on the sea away from the regulation of traditional state forms and build modules, build forms of architecture that are dynamic and that could reconfigure in different sorts of ways. So if you don't like living under one system of governance, you simply move your module across the bay to join a group who will offer you a different system of governance within a dynamic market. Some of these luminaries, some of these NRXs, these neo-reactionaries, are also coders and software developers, and they're very, very keen to develop software, what they would see as urban operating systems. They operate with a kind of a computationist ontology, if I could put it like that, to develop virtual spaces such that we can facilitate exit. If you don't like being in a particular group, voice doesn't work, democratic forms are too slow, you simply exit and you have the operation of a market to facilitate that form of exit. Indeed, Patrick Friedman is quoted as saying, and this is replicated time and time again by both Monbiot and Nick Land, that the only human right is the right to exit. The only human right is the right to exit. So for them, based upon a particularly strange reading of Hirschman's Exit, Voice and Loyalty, exit is the only right, the only thing that will actually facilitate a form of capitalist accelerationism that isn't actually fettered by democracy and these strange ideas that people in the cathedral hold about justice, participation, warm solidarities, and so on.
So you're kind of suggesting then, and I think this is taking who's this from in your paper? This is, summing up sort of Friedman, suggesting that it's a way of effectively experimenting with creating new societies. You know, these seasteading spaces are opportunities to kind of operate extrajudicially outside of the space of kind of state-based laws and regulations, and to start experimenting with new forms of organizing society. That's what some of the kind of underpinning ideas of neo-reactionary sort of future visions of the world rely on. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, Nick Land, in a particularly repulsive paper, says the only thing I would insist on is fragmentation. The ability for people to experiment with different ways of organizing themselves and to allow people to exit from these different agglomerations as the mode of regulating these systems. No voice, no democracy, just operating as a consumer. But, you know, it sounds a crazy idea, and no one in reality thinks that anyone's going to build a seastead anytime soon, although there are some incredible renderings and designs of what these things might look like. They are urban imaginaries, but they're urban imaginaries of a very particular type, because key to this neo-reactionary mode of operating is a notion that Nick Land advocates for, which is the notion of what he calls hyperstition, the notion of hyperstition. The idea that there are often the development of cultural objects. They might be movies, they might be books, they might be bits of software. And for those of you working in architecture, of course, they might well be prototypes, they might well be designs, they might well be plans, but they're entities which will themselves into existence. They're fictional constructs that will themselves into existence. The notion of seasteading is, if you like, a hyperstitional resource that's willing itself into existence. And people like Land will point to a number of texts and a number of novels and films which have done just this. He might point towards the movie Metropolis. He might point to Blade Runner. And crucially, they'll point towards a very, very important novel by Neil Stephenson, published in 1992, called Snow Crash, which in a sense is a description of these very, very familiar tropes now in terms of seasteading and forms of a virtual environment which allow for exit. So they point towards texts, novels, cultural artifacts, prototypes and software which provide imaginal resources, allow people to begin to think about these forms of possibility as a mechanism for changing cultural politics.
So effectively you're suggesting that the hyperstitious object is a sort of an imagination, a construction of something in the future that then, by that sort of strength of its vision, the strength of its kind of capacity, starts other people imagining and other people bringing into play some of the ideas, some of the realities of that. I mean, I think, just quoting from your paper here, you say that these hyperstitious objects could be designs, diagrams, fictions, maps, movies, as you've spoken about, plans, philosophies, prototypes, theories, dreams, and more. And I think that's a really interesting aspect to it, the kind of dreams, and that's something I picked out as a term that you draw on, that the sort of neo-reactionary future is dreaming of a certain kind. It's a type of dreaming, really, and it's a type of dreaming that in a way is sort of wishing itself into reality.
that's right. But it's not just dreaming, it's dreaming backed with millions and billions of dollars by people who now have huge amounts of wealth, as I showed in that opening diagram. People who, for the most part, have made their money from technology, and for the most part, probably have read more Ayn Rand than they have Karl Marx. Many of these people are radical libertarians, and some of them also hold a range of views which are very much counter to the dominant views of, as we call them previously, the cathedral. Anti-democratic, a belief in a form of sociobiology, a form of hyper-racism, a form in a kind of the operation of a market through neo-Darwinian forms of competition, and for a profound belief that states need to be deconstructed. If I could just I don't know whether people will be able to see this book here. I mentioned it to you before.
Yeah.
This is, I think, a hyperstitious book, as it turns out. It's a book that not many of us read when it came out in 1997. It's called The Sovereign Individual, Mastering the Transition to the Information Age. And you might be able to see that one of its authors, one of its co-authors, is someone called Lord William Rees-Mogg, another dynasty. This is the father of Jacob Rees-Mogg, the former editor of the Times. And this is one of a trilogy of books. One was called The Great Reckoning, and the other one was called Blood on the Streets. These are extreme analytics, libertarian analytics about the future. This is published in 1997, and it's a frightening book because, as Alistair Campbell points out when he read it, it doesn't just predict, it actually provides a blueprint for much of what has happened since 1997. It provides, if you like, a kind of a precursor to neo-reactionary thought. It argues for the necessity to move beyond state forms. It argues for the necessity to develop what in the book they call cyber currencies, what we might now call blockchain technologies for the transference of value, Bitcoin and such like. But the key to the sovereign individual is the idea that we need to allow individual agents, rich, wealthy individual agents in particular, to have peer-to-peer transactions, not to be mediated by state forms, not to have to deal with exchange values mediated through the machinations of the nation states. It's a book that argues profoundly for the necessity for people to be able to engage in a series of network bilateral exchanges. Much else is in the book. The role of technology and a role of really centralized technology which bypasses the state form and crucially bypasses forms of state regulation. For these people, regulation is the thing that is the problem. They don't like regulation and they believe it functions as a profound fetter on the operations of markets, extreme libertarian forms of market life, moderated by new digital technologies.
So I think that brings us onto the part of the title we haven't touched upon, which is the Techno-Fogies bit there. So because in a sense, it might be quite easy to take these ideas, these sort of dream spaces, these hyperstitious objects, these imaginings of this future of living on the sea, moving around, you know, kind of creating these independent nation states that are able to function outside the regulation of governments and you know, existing state infrastructures. You know, these are all dreams. They're sort of science fiction futures. They're fantasies, right? But what you're suggesting is actually behind this is both substantial amounts of money, significant quantities of money from some of the wealthiest technological industrialists on the planet. But also, and I suppose inevitably within that, systems and processes of technological development that are already being implemented in our cultures. Is that right? So this, because, you know, I could sit here and hear this and go, yes, well, why do we need to worry? It sounds mad, you know, it's not going to happen. Is there some reality to what we're talking about?
Well, maybe again, just to break up what we're doing, perhaps if I could just share a screen again, just to show some images, because I think it's quite useful to put some faces to names in this regard. So I hope that I can share this image.
Yeah.
Does that appear?
Yes.
These are the luminaries I was pointing towards. This is Nick Land, Peter Thiel, Patrick Friedman, and Curtis Yarvin. The notion of the techno-fogie comes from a brilliant paper by the cultural theorist Paul Gilroy in a really a great paper that I would really recommend people to read. I'll provide some references for people if they want to follow it up. But he's talking about this odd couple. He's talking about this programmer, this blogger, the key figure in terms of the production of this code, Curtis Yarvin and Nick Land. And this is when he uses this phrase, the techno-fogie, seeing Curtis Yarvin as a prominent techno-fogie who's a coder and a computer programmer, as he calls himself, who nevertheless draws inspiration from some of the more obscure works penned by Victorian theorists of imperial domination, people who combine an extreme form of conservatism on the one hand with a technical competence on the other, and who seem as well to be interested in the reinvention, the re-articulation of essentially eugenics, what they call human biodiversity. And many of these people are also associated with ideas to do with not just racial stereotyping and not just gender stereotyping, but of a return to an imagined way of being, which can be facilitated by going back to basic principles and doing that through the utilization of digital technologies. These are the two books I mentioned, The Sovereign Individual by James Dale Davidson and Lord William Rees-Mogg, which cites this novel Snow Crash by Neil Stevenson. Indeed, the book has been described as a snow crash with footnotes. And in a sense, in this little kind of grid here, we can maybe try and summarize the role of the techno-fogies within this imagined facilitation of this new form of GovCorp. And in the paper, we describe it as an ideal type, things that this group are against and things that this group are for, and also then their relationship to technological developments within that. So some of the imageries around here refer to things we've already spoken about: the exit voice loyalty, Nick Land's writing, the notion of the cathedral, and the notion that what we need to do is to fragment the world into a series of competing patchworks of governance structures. And if you could just bear with me, I think these are the 6 elements that I would want to use as a kind of an ideal typical summary of what is at stake here. They believe that democracy is doomed. They believe in what they call rage: retire all government employees, retire all government employees. And here you can understand why they celebrate the killer clowns, why they like Trump, why they like people who bring in a kind of a business ethos rather than an administrative ethos and a civil service ethos. Get rid of government employees, set the state up as a business, and appoint a chief executive officer or a monarch. So that's the first thing that they don't like. The second thing they don't like is discourses of equality. They believe it to be a myth. They believe in the reality, the ontology of human biodiversity, and they promulgate a vision called hyper-racism. They believe that there are real differences between individuals, and it's a new form of scientific racism. They also, and this is where we came in, don't like the cathedral. Their current plan is to attack elites and liberals and wokeness and PC-ness and academia, because the cathedral needs to be defeated. We need to move towards a post-truth situation where the forms of expertise that we have traditionally relied upon is no longer able to act as a fetter on uncompensated capitalism. So in order to do that, and I'll come to the technology in a moment, they advocate the three things that they like. They believe in exit, but no voice. They're interested in thinking about how we can develop new patchwork state forms, and go and read Snow Crash if you want to get an image of what that might look like, where the current form of state governance has withered on the vine and is just one of a number of competing state forms, the most successful of which is the mafia. So they want to advocate for seasteading, for city-states, for gated communities, for off-world worlds. Think Elon Musk. Think about the dream of space travel that these people try to advocate for. And there's also a virtual concomitant of this. They want to develop software, a piece of software that Yavin has been involved in writing with, backed by Thiel's millions, a piece of software called Urbit, which functions in much the same way as seasteading does within a virtual environment. But here we come to the technology. Many of these people also believe in the singularity. They believe that artificial intelligence, automation is inevitably leading to a form of post-humanism. And indeed, the extreme right accelerationists, if I could call them that, would go as far, and Land is probably the best example of this, an extreme nihilist, goes as far as to say that the process is all. Humans, as we've understood them, are simply bearers of this process, of this dynamic. And there's an inevitability, they would argue, that we're moving towards a cyborg state, that we're moving towards a fusion of humanity and technology, such that we begin to merge. Think Cylons in America, think Battlestar Galactica, and think of the way in which they draw upon these profound science fiction motifs within their hyperstitious imaginings. This is Blade Runner, this is Replicants, this is the sense of the inevitability, if only we didn't have to regulate the systems, that the singularity would be upon us. And then the models that they advocate for are, for the most part, non-democratic GovCorps, which are technologically advanced, often city-states, Singapore, what they would call Neo-China, Beijing, Shanghai. And at the time that they were writing, they would also have included Hong Kong. But as we've seen in recent years and months, Hong Kong might not be such a good example, where the demands, the protests, the demands for democratic decision-making, rather than a kind of a corporate system of governance, is being profoundly challenged. But for them, technologies, decentralized technologies, blockchain, Bitcoin, and systems of re-decentralization of the internet are the technologies that will facilitate for them this new state form by which GovCorps, competing GovCorps run by a business leader or a monarch will replace democratic governance structures.
So you were saying in there about technology and the sort of singularities. So just to kind of unpack a little bit, the singularity being that moment when sort of the systems of computing and artificial intelligence, machine learning, start to converge with human intelligence in a way where they become inseparable. You can't distinguish between the human and the non-human, the technology and then the sort of physical biological body. Is that right? Is that sort of singularity that you speak of?
Well, it sounds like some sort of crazy scientific vision, but people like Land in particular write in this way. They I suppose would say that's the default position. That's the teleological conclusion that we're moving towards. The only thing that's preventing us from moving in those directions is the cathedral, is people who want to regulate, who talk about notions of affect, of humanity, of justice, of thinking about for land, it's in a nihilistic sense of the process being all, and humans just being historical bearers of that process, the inevitable outcome being some kind of convergence with artificial intelligence. But more practically, I suppose, you know, there are real concerns, aren't there, at the moment about our future. Think about the current COVID crisis, and think about the way in which people are being asked to retrain for different sorts of work, to think about what we can actually function to do, where the only thing left seems to be, it seems to be cyber security, digital work, artificial intelligences, which you know, we can't any longer read because machine learning allows them to develop efficient ways of engaging in predictive analytics. You know, these are real concerns, and within American digital Silicon Valley libertarian thought, that the welcoming of this vision of this merger with technology is a very, very strong trope. Again, I'm wanting to resist it. I'm not advocating for it. I'm just saying that these are very, very real impulses, that people with these batshit crazy ideas are actually very, very influential and very, very, very wealthy. And so ideas which only a few years ago would have been at the very, very margins of our understandings, of our concerns, of our political life, have rapidly in the last 2 or 3 years come to the very, very center of government. If you read the blog of Dominic Cummings, for instance, you will see that he cites and reads many of the same people that people like the neo-reactionaries also cite. These ideas which prioritize a kind of a computationalist ontology over the social sciences, that advocates for big data, for predictive analytics, for the use of algorithms as a better means of making decisions and allocating resources rather than administrative structures, goes to the heart of that particular project. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that Cummings is an unmitigated neo-reactionary, although, you know, who knows, but there's certainly elements of his belief structures which actually correspond to this. A preference for business startups over traditional systems of the administrative state, the desire to smash and to break and to reform the administrative state and the civil service, the belief that we need to hire people who are super forecasters, big data analysts, people interested in predictive analytics, the use of algorithms primarily as a means to actually find our way through various kind of entangled policy decisions. You mentioned, you know, the new white paper. It's got Cummings' hands all over it. It could have been written by the neo-reactionaries in a sense. The idea that we can produce algorithms that will zone the country, each postcode, to be allocated to one different kind of planning type. The ability, as I read it, to actually metricize aesthetics, to actually have some kind of measure of what beauty is. This is not such a distance from some of the ideas that the neo-reactionaries might advocate for. And I should say, we've already seen under COVID that many of the contracts for this kind of work have gone to companies owned by Peter Thiel and the neo-reactionaries, Palantir.
Yes, and gone to companies that are very, very small, almost non-existent startups that have, you know, less money in the bank than I do, that are taking very substantial government contracts for PPE supply. You know, I think there's been some interesting reporting done by that who's it, Open Journalism? I can't recall, but recently around some of those where some of those contracts are going. So there's interesting research being carried out there. But I think that's a really good point. It just helps us to bring us back in the sort of last 5 or so minutes to the kind of current condition that we're looking at in Britain. And I think reading the Royal Institute of British Architects sort of summary of the white paper, because unfortunately today I didn't have time to sit down and read the whole white paper, but I'm sure it'd be very, very fascinating exercise to do with this kind of a lens on. What struck me as well as the sort of enabling popular and replicable forms of architecture and building is a new digitally enabled planning process that's data driven, is something that's stated quite overtly in that. And so what you're suggesting is then that part of that process could be the deployment of machine learning, of algorithmic technologies to be making decisions about our built environment and sort of almost building us into that labor process as well. Yeah. I mean, I often think that we're already at the behest and at the kind of work of the machines. Whenever I get my password wrong and trying to log into my Gmail and I have to identify some traffic lights, I'm sure I'm working for the algorithm there rather than the algorithm working for me, right? But what you're suggesting is then that these algorithmic processes, this sort of ways that computers can help us to make decisions in the world, will increasingly become the way that decisions about our built environment become made. Is that correct?
I think it's profound. And Harrison Smith, who used to work at Newcastle, is now at Sheffield, who's helped me write this paper, has done some other work which makes this point very, very clearly. He's been doing work on what we used to call mobile phones, now basically data dredging, big data surveillance devices, which is what they are. And he's been looking at the role of location and the ability to track and trace us through space. I mean, we know how this does or doesn't work with COVID, but the point that he makes is that increasingly we are at the behest of the algorithm. That in a sense, what's happened is that the world of social media, the world of Twitter and Facebook and our tastes in music and preferences and such like, move across platforms, and they become embedded within these tracking devices. So in a sense, this piece of technology, that we are increasingly ubiquitous, in a sense is a very, very subtle codification of my habitus, of my tastes and preferences, of my politics, of my tastes in music, of my viewing habits, of the books that I've read. It's all embodied within this device. And now that device is mobilized. I move around the city. I come in close juxtaposition with you, Ed, or whoever, that we can see where people like me and you with particular tastes and preferences move, how we function. It used to be said back in the day that, you are where you live. That if you had someone's address, you could make all kinds of predictions about their voting behavior and their tastes and preferences. Now it's you are where you go. And you can imagine the dynamic modeling of cities that's actually going on at the moment, where the footfall is, where people go, where people move. And to come back to the neo-reactionary aspects of that, the dream is that you can occupy the same territory, the same space, but the technology and the architectures of exit will allow you to live under different systems of governance within that space, based upon these kinds of devices. The merger of the digital sphere with the architectural sphere, allowing patterns of differentiation, of access, of software sorting within the same space, seems to me to be the aspiration of much of this technology. So the mobile phone in particular is something that we are using to do work for these organizations. We are mapping out the city in incredibly subtle ways. We know where members of the left-leaning cathedral go and eat, what kind of music they like, where they choose to live, who they form relationships with. We are in a situation, it seems to me, we're at the very cusp of us all being brought into this mass mapping exercise based upon our activity with those bits of increasingly mundane bits of technology.
And that mapping exercise produces data points, I guess, right? And that data has value.
Huge amounts of value. I mean, where you go and what you do. We know about the Chinese model, but it's happening here as well in a different way. Is literally a system of value in terms of hierarchies of worth and of access. It's in a sense credit scoring writ large in a very, very nuanced way, which in a sense is necessary for the new smart city technologies that the neo-reactionaries advocate for, which is about the development of operating systems for the urban. It's a computationalist ideology, the idea that engineering and computer science knows better than the social sciences in terms of actually managing the urban form. This is why I think this kind of work, however crazy it might sound, is actually important to come to terms with, because it actually underpins the ideologies and the belief systems of many people who are actually writing the code. And if you just bear with me again, I don't know whether I'll be able to share the screen again, but there's an image from a fantastic paper that I'll give people to read here. From this fantastic paper, The Darkness at the End of the Tunnel, Artificial Intelligence and Neo-reaction, which I think makes the point brilliantly. It shows a picture of the inside of Siena Cathedral at the bottom, and at the top it shows an image of a piece of artificial intelligence in terms of what it sees. And because it was trained to recognize cats and dogs, it still sees cats and dogs within its own interpretation of the image. And the point that is made by Haider here is that metaphorically, the desires, he says here, conscious and unconscious of the machine's creators are inevitably implicated in its ostensibly autonomous development. If the builders of technology are transmitting their values into machinery, this makes the culture of Silicon Valley, and that culture is a neo-reactionary culture. It makes the culture of Silicon Valley a matter of more widespread consequence. Technology, code, machine learning is not neutral. It embodies, it embeds particular ideological preferences. And my concern is that we are wandering into a form of life where neo-reactionary ideas and their variants are ubiquitous within the code and the software that we all utilize. We already know in social media that exit is ubiquitous. The bubbles that we form, the clusters that we form on social media and Facebook and on Twitter are now being writ large within real material geographies. We see it profoundly within the American situation. You know, we're now a week away from the election, and we know that these worlds and the demarcation of those worlds through social media is now profound. These are neo-reactionary ideas and ideals embedded within software, embedded within Palantir, embedded within Facebook, within Twitter, within all of those social media technologies. They are premised upon a particular set of ideologies which is associated with these billionaire libertarians.
Well, thanks, Roger. I think that's a good point to pause for a moment and just ask if anybody has any questions, you want to put them into the chat function on YouTube. We've got a few minutes to take any questions, and if Sarah, Ali, you're happy to forward those through if it comes through. If anybody does, send it through to the chat on Zoom. But just whilst we wait for anything to come through, I think it's really interesting that we're talking about this here in the context of Newcastle, Roger, and that idea that data is the new oil, or the new sort of extractive industry of our time, and particularly where we're speaking from here, or very near to here, is the site of the oldest mine in Newcastle, Elswick North Colliery. Where in the sort of late 1300s started to extract coal from the ground. And yeah, it's no surprise that data mining is named as such, it's termed the mining of data. And on the site where that mine is now the Helix site, what was the Science Central and the old Federation breweries. And right there is the UK's National Innovation Centre for Data as well. So, there's a really interesting relationship between those economies, those kind of earlier economies of extractive industry and the ground and the soil, and now the sort of economies of extractive data. extracting our likes, our dislikes, our preferences and tastes. So somehow, you know, Newcastle feels a kind of curiously appropriate space to be talking about this.
Absolutely.
I think there's something, yeah, Dave. Hello, Dave. Nice to see you pushing that through to the chat. So Dave asks, so Dave Webb, who also joins us from the School of Planning here at Newcastle, what could government do to push back against the rise of these neo-reactionary technologies, Roger?
Well, I think some governments have already been captured by these neo-reactionary ideas. I think we need to support the civil service. I think we need to support bureaucratic forms of decision making. We need to defend but be pragmatic about the possibilities of democratic decision making. I think we need a robust defence of universities and of free media. And I think we need to educate ourselves about what's actually going on in relation to these technological developments, and actually begin to join the dots together. These aren't disparate forms of change. When you have a reading of the neo-reactionary agenda, you can see how many of these things actually come together in ways that you might not expect. So I think that we need to educate ourselves. I know that sounds such a silly thing to say. I think we need a good description of what the problem is at hand, and we need to recognise that very, very quickly we're dealing with ideological forms which are not just in the commitments to forms of neoliberalism that we've been familiar with. This is something new, it seems to me. This is a form of post-neoliberalism that is associated with a technologically adept libertarianism, which is also well versed in progressive politics. They're Gramscians. They know about hegemony. They know how to use social media in particular to build hegemonic blocks, and how to counter what they would see as the progressives within the academy. I think there's a huge agenda that isn't just to do with national governments. It's something that needs to be worked on at a global scale to try and understand exactly what's happened. And in a sense, at the heart of this is a global necessity, following Piketty, to challenge the concentration of this huge wealth in the hands of these oligarchs. We need to get back to a more corporate form of capitalism. If we're going to get back to it, we need to think about how we can use systems of global taxation and wealth redistribution in order to get back to a system of corporate governance and administrative functioning, which does away with this disaster capitalism, which feeds on chaos that these new technologies invoke.
There's another question from Miranda. How much influence does such fascist speculative thinking have in Silicon Valley around imagined futures? Well,
the evidence would suggest that it's had a profound impact. There's clearly kind of progressive tendencies within Silicon Valley, and we've seen various sorts of challenges in relation to Google and the knowledge of the impact that these technologies have had upon people. There's a recent, I think, Netflix documentary about this. I can't recall the title of it. Someone might be able to help me.
Social Dilemma, I believe.
The Social Dilemma, I think it was called. But I think what was interesting about that is once people who were progressives and you know, understood what was happening, once they understood the way in which the technology was functioning, they were appalled. You know, they wouldn't let their children do certain things. They had a critical engagement with the very technology that they'd made. But the technology's out there in the wild already, and embedded within it are a set of kind of libertarian ideas, which we really need to capture profoundly. I know this might seem an odd thing to say, but actually one of the best critiques of this has been the last 2 or 3 series of South Park. Absolutely brilliant analyses of the manner in which we're no longer able to attend to concentrate the impact on cognition of these technologies, all towards a particular political end.
I'll have to have a watch of them. I think there's one last question before we wrap up. and that's from Jeremy Crampton, again, member of staff here. Can you say more about left accelerationists, such as Mark Fisher?
Yes, I mean, there's a story to be told here about different forms of accelerationism. Can you see that screen? No, let me just try and share the screen. I know we're struck for time here. Is that clear on the screen?
Yes.
Let me just say something, first of all, about what we mean by accelerationism. And in a sense, I think this explains some of the terminology that I've been using. But this is from Nick Land, and this is a good illustration of the way in which Land writes. His form of right accelerationism is articulated very, very clearly here. He says, for accelerationism, the crucial lesson was this: a negative feedback circuit, such as a steam engine governor or a thermostat, functions to keep some state of the system in the same place. Its product, in the language formulated by what he calls French philosophical cyberneticists Charles Deleuze and Guattari, is territorialization. People will be familiar with that notion. Negative feedback stabilizes the process by correcting drift and thus inhibiting a departure beyond a limited range. Dynamics are placed in the service of fixity, a higher level stasis or state. All equilibrium models of complex systems and processes are like this. To capture the contrary trend characterized by self-reinforcing errancy, flight or escape, Deleuze and Guattari coined the inelegant but influential term deterritorialization. Deterritorialization is the only thing accelerationism has ever really talked about. Then he moves away from the engineering computational metaphor to a social metaphor, and this is what he says. In social historical terms, the line of deterritorialization corresponds to uncompensated capitalism. Capitalism left to its own devices. The basic, and of course to some real highly consequential degree actually installed schema, is a positive feedback circuit within which commercialization and industrialization mutually excite each other in a runaway process from which modernity draws its gradient. Marx and Nietzsche were amongst those to capture important aspects of that trend. As the circuit is incrementally closed or intensified, it exhibits ever greater autonomy or automation. It becomes more tightly autoproductive, which is only what positive feedback already says. Because its appeal is nothing beyond itself, it is inherently nihilistic. It has no conceivable meaning besides self-amplification. It grows in order to grow. Person-kind, mankind, is its temporary host, not its master. Its only purpose is itself. If it weren't for the cathedral, if it weren't for fetters, if it weren't things that could control this uncontrollable accelerationism, we would be in a runaway world. That's the right accelerationist view from Land. Left accelerationism, most closely associated, I suppose, with people like Nick Cernick, but also popularized by the journalist Paul Mason in his book on post-capitalism, which people might be familiar with, tries to take that basic premise and to think about the way in which we could intervene to actually orientate these accelerationist impulses towards a greater good. And it really goes back to old debates about socialist calculation. The idea that in a sense, the only reason why neoliberals, or one of the only reasons why neoliberals were so committed to market forms, was that they didn't have the data in real time to allow for real-time allocation of resource. Now, if you reimagine big data as non-marketized, non-priced data based on logistics and the metrics that we generate, this is the idea that perhaps you could actually harness that in more productive ways to actually try and take the kind of the data assemblage and actually don't just let it be translated into market values, but to orientate it in different sorts of ways. What's interesting about Fisher's role in this, the late and the great Mark Fisher, is that Fisher did his PhD under Land. And land was incredibly influential on a number of people in cultural studies, political economy, music, sonics, art, and other aspects of life. In a sense, they are two sides of the same coin. Fisher taking a profoundly leftist route, and Land clearly going off in a direction of nihilism, marketization, racism, and frankly fascism. I think the impact on the mental health of Mark Fisher was very, very telling, and one can only imagine what he would make of the current situation. He took his life in 2017, and I think we all miss his ability to read these accelerationist tendencies within popular culture, within music. He was, as we say in the paper, I think, one of a new generation of thinkers who we've lost, to help us, to guide us through this maelstrom of chaos and difficulty that we're currently experiencing.
Great. I think we better wrap it up there. I had a recommendation from Alessandro Vincentelli to agreeing with Roger, the episode of South Park, 2 brilliant episodes to watch: Wish Fulfillment Center and Jeff Bezos's Brain. So I've got my evening's entertainment sorted. Yeah, that's a good point. It is slightly scarier than Halloween. So it feels that there's a kind of tinge of reality to some of these things, more than a tinge of reality. Roger, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating conversation. It's been really interesting building this with you as well over the last week or so, and the conversations we've had have been hugely enlightening to my understanding of technology. You know, we're all compelled to engage with it now in ways that we haven't been before. So I think it's really crucial that we see other aspects of its sort of operational frameworks. So this is the first event of our new public programs. We've got another couple coming up. We've got Finn Williams and Amy Linford from Public Practice, who are an organisation that works sort of between architectural practice and local authorities, and they'll be talking more about planning in those contexts. And we've got Kate Wagner joining us as well, a McMansion Health fame, and Kate is an avid user of social media channels to communicate ideas, and quite kind of, at one level, quite humorous takedowns of the culture of building in the US, but also quite critically insightful ways of looking at how materials, structures, and buildings play out some of the fantasies of technology and some of the sort of dreams of living and inhabiting the world. So thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. I hope this has worked as well on YouTube as it has here. We're going to end the stream now and bid you a farewell. Have a nice evening, everybody. Thank you. Okay, that's the stream ended on YouTube.